So today what I'm going to do, as you can see, is talk about depicting and imagining. But what I want to do is to give you the context in which I am thinking about this issue here. And I'm going to start with my usual beginning, which is to communicate is to make common. So then the question is, what is it that you're making common? And then also, in this case, how? And so today I'm going to talk about one way, how, namely depicting, and a couple of days, the next 2 days I'll be talking about some other things here. I'm going to start with what I'm going to call the 20th century view of the how of communication. And basically it is that there is verbal communication and then there's nonverbal communication. These are two people you should know about if even you don't know. They're watching a basketball game, and Obama is explaining to Cameron, who apparently has never seen a basketball game. I don't know, how things are going. So there's the verbal part, there's the nonverbal part. This is kind of standard. But if you go back 15 centuries, there's another quite different view, which is there's diegesis, and this is again Plato discussing this in the Republic. There's diegesis in which you are basically describing things. So Demosthenes orating things would be an instance of diegesis, but there's also mimesis. And the prototype for Plato was Greek comedies and tragedies. That is, things that were happening on the stage. That was what he thought of as the prototype. But of course there's, and I'm not going to call them those terms, I'm going to call them those terms, describing and depicting. There's also a third thing, which actually has a modern analysis using a Greek term, namely deixis, where you're pointing at things. This is not something that Plato discussed, but I'm sure was there because here we have pictures of Demosthenes pointing. So and I'm going to call this indicating. So basically we've got these three methods here. Describing, where this is Plato's diegesis, simple narratives, orations, depicting, comedies, tragedies, pantomimes, that kind of stuff, and indicating Greek deixis. As I said, there's no Platonic version of this. But what this says is basically you can take communication and divide it into these three ways. Now, so here's the 21st century view. That is, you divide it by modality. And I'm in a psychology department, linguistic departments. This is the way it's just done always. Everybody does it this way, as opposed to doing it this way, by method. And this method, for those who are really in the know, will recognize this as Peirce, Charles Sanders Peirce, and it's dividing those in these methods. This is going to be my view. I think it has been a mistake, and I will show you why I think it's a mistake, to use the modality as the way of dividing up communication, as opposed to thinking of methods. And this is the argument that I'm going to be making. Now, the difference between mimesis and diegesis actually has been, it hasn't been in linguistics, but it's been in literature and even in philosophy. It's been revived in recent years by these people, among others. So Bakhtin, David Lodge's, I'm going to quote in just a minute, and Ken Walton, who is one of my real heroes in this field, he is a philosopher. So you have to find your inspiration where you get them, and Ken is a good place to get the stuff on depiction, as I will show you. So here's the idea behind Lodge. So Lodge has a really interesting, he's a novelist, an English novelist, but he does all sorts of stuff on literary criticism, and here's his description. So he says, describing the alternation of authorial, however that's pronounced, authorial description and characters' verbal interaction remains the woof and warp of literary narration to this day. This is David Lodge. And here is the way I would illustrate it. So you take, this is part of Pride and Prejudice, and here's a nice description here. The idea of Mr. Collins with all his solemn composure being run away with by his feelings, made Elizabeth, and so on. It goes on. But then you do quotations, and these quotations are sitting in the middle of all of these novels. This is what Lodge would call depicting, or he would call this mimesis. That is, this is the mimesis part. And it's the direct speech of characters. But there's also indicating, if you look, they're indicating within the descriptions there are these things that refer, and let's just take the ones that refer to Mr. Collins. So there's Mr. Collins, his, he, and so on. Here, there's also indicating within the depiction. So this depiction has references to Mr. Collins, but in references to my and I and myself. That's the way this all works. So the whole point here is that, as David Lodge put it, roughly speaking, mimesis gives the sense of reality in fiction, the illusion of access to the reality of personal experience. That is, you see, you hear these, you read these, actually in this case, these quotations, and you're getting the sense of reality. It's kind of straight. You're getting a real look into the reality, as opposed to diegesis, which is the contextualizing information, the framework of values which provide thematic unity and coherence. And this is just David Lodge. Now, this is a really interesting insight. It comes from literary criticism. It doesn't come from linguists or philosophers or psychologists. And that's too bad, because this is a very nice way of dividing things up. Describing in traditional ways, you're using words, syntax, semantics, traditional things that is studied by linguists in great detail, as opposed to studying things that are really depicting kinds of depiction, quotations, as I've just been giving you, iconic gestures, and I'll give you lots of other sorts of things, as opposed to indicating, so that where you're pointing, and words like I, you have implicit in them, well, actually, they don't have implicit in them. They make use of a kind of pointing or indicating. So these are indexes to people. This is direct speech. This is just David Lodge again, which is basically Plato again. Now, the thing is, these very same methods, these are not part of just literary discourse. They're part of everyday discourse. And I'm going to be using a lot of examples from Malcolm Bilson, who is a well-known American pianist. And when I was talking to, the other day, Hans Poulsen, he said, oh, yes, of course, I know Malcolm Bilson. Here is Malcolm Bilson describing something.
We can play loud, we can play soft, we can play connected or disconnected.
These are descriptions. He's just describing things, and this is Malcolm Bilson. So the word play, for example, what it does is to pick out a category of things, category of activity in this case, and we know how categories work because that's all that philosophers and psychologists and linguists ever do. They don't look at anything but categories of that sort. So this is describing as, I'm calling it. This
is a late 18th century Viennese piano.
So he's pointing at this piano. That is a good case of indicating, so he's pointing. And it is to indicate things is to locate in space and time. I'm going to talk about that in great detail tomorrow. So I'm going to leave it for now, but here is...
has this little in it, which is so nice.
Now, what he just did here, of course, is go D to dum. And what he's doing is depicting how something sounds. That is, they're not, as it happens, he's using some syllables to do this, but he's really doing a depiction of some kind of sound. And he uses this in-breath thing also as a kind of sound. So he's depicting, and what he's trying to do is to establish some kind of perceptual appearance. We're supposed to imagine this perceptual appearance by using his depiction there. So the methods look something like this. Actually, they relate to really three quite different kinds of modes of thinking, as I will say here. So describing as depends crucially on our ability to categorize things in the world. So I look at this, I say, this is a lectern, that's a chair, that's a person. I have all these categories out there, and that is what gets coded or encoded, in this case in conventional parts of language, nouns and verbs and so on. Indicating is where I point and I locate things. This has to do, basically, it has nothing to do with categories. It has to do with locating. I keep track of the space around me and I locate things within that space. And that's a different method altogether. It's a different mode of thinking as well. But this one is the one I'm going to be interested in today, depicting quotations, demonstrations, iconic gestures. This is really dealing with perception, perceptual appearances, the way things feel, the way things look, the way things sound, the way things, perceptual things. So these things just are not alike. That is, yes, you can categorize some of these things here, but the feeling or the appearance, the experience of appearance is just not the same as these things up here. That's going to be the argument. Okay, so now, the thing is, almost all of what I've been showing you here are composites, or some people call them composites, of more than one thing. So let's take this.
But has this little in it, which is so nice.
So you remember that one? Well, basically, it's a combination of all of these three methods. It first of all says, but NP1, it's just a placeholder for now, has this, and there's this is a placeholder there too, little N3, which is so nice. Now the indicating, so he's telling you within the sentence here, listen to this depiction out here, and here he does the depiction. So he does a depiction as NP1, and he does another depiction as N3. Again, if we listen to that thing here, I can't do them both at the same time. So that's what you've got to recognize. Almost everything that we do is a combination, and I'm calling these composites, of these three methods in some way or another. So I'm going to take a look at these spontaneous depictions because we tend to think of depictions as a very narrow category, and it's a hugely broad category. And Marianne and I, I'm sure, are going to agree on this. There's a longer story here. So here's a hand gesture. We know about all of these because Marianne does them better than anybody.
We can play loud, we can play soft, we can play connected or disconnected, we can slide on the voice or the violin, we can vibrate. That's all we've got.
So we can slide on the violin, we can vibrate. He's depicting someone playing the violin, selectively, highly selectively, but he's nevertheless doing it. Here is a direct quotation, and listen to this for a while.
At the University of Illinois, where I used to teach, there was a voice professor who said you should always speak like this. And we go by his office and hear, well, I can see you Wednesday at 3 o'clock.
So you can go by his office and you can hear, well, I can see. Now that's a quotation. But what has he just done? He's done the whole depiction of the whole scene in that. He hasn't done just the words, he's done something very much more. Here he's doing a facial gesture. Now I want you to notice when it occurs.
I mean, I can't imagine it couldn't be that. I wouldn't think so.
So he's playing something badly. He doesn't do this grimace then. He waits until he gets the sentence and then he gives you the grimace. The grimace is a communicative act that's part of his, that he is a composite part of his utterance there. Here is a full demonstration, and I'll play it for you twice.
It's not really a folk song anymore. And it says rubato.
Now, I challenge many of the pianists in this room to be able to do what he was doing, which was he's playing this piece in a perfectly good timing and talking over it in a complete other timing. That is, he's doing co-gesture speech. Now, that is something that our colleagues in the field just don't know exists or don't think exists. So listen to it again.
It's not really a folk song, you know.
Listen to him talk.
And it says rubato.
Actually, he does this all the time. He's playing this stuff and he's talking. And, you know, I'm a pianist. There's no possible way I could do what he's doing there. Okay, here's another demonstration of a quite different sort.
Separating eggs is actually very easy, and there's several ways to do it. Once you give it a little tap to it, you try to split it in half, and then you just take each half and you drop the yolk in it, and you let the white just roll right out of it, and then you put the yolk over here.
So this is a demonstration using props, real props. I mean, these are real eggs, real glasses, real everything. Actually, so the piano was a real piano too, remember. The fact that there are props involved in these things doesn't make them any less depictions. Okay, so what is a depiction? So here's a depiction. This is Philip Glass by Chuck Close. Anybody who knows Chuck Close? And what you realize, of course, is here's the point of this. And if this doesn't come, if you haven't learned this by the end of this talk, then you're really in trouble. I am in this way a Magretian, if you could say that, a Magritite, a Magritist, whatever it is. And I'm going to call this the Pausen-Piep principle. This is not a pipe, as he says here. And what does he mean? He means this is just a depiction of a pipe. The pipe and the depiction are not the same thing. And I can't tell you how many of my colleagues in psychology make this mistake. So this is the Pausen-Piep principle here. That is, there are always two domains. So this is actually Chuck Close's thing that I just showed you. And notice the size of the woman next to it. This is a gigantic depiction. Of course, it's a depiction that's utterly outsized, but it's a depiction of this guy here, who was, presumably, his photograph was taken, Close works from photographs. The photograph was somehow taken way back in some other time. That is, there's a depicting domain, which is that one over here. There's a depicted domain, which is over here. These are not the same. And you do not want to confuse these two. And that's, again, another part of what I'm going to try to argue. So depictions are physical analogs of depicted scenes, like so they can be in any sensory modality. In this case, he's using gestures and sound. We will see them in all of these different modalities. And they're intended to enable others to imagine perceiving the depicted scene. That is, again, there's the difference between the depiction and the depicted scene. And what he's doing up here is depicting this thing here. And that's what you're supposed to really imagine. Okay, so how do we make a principal distinction here between these things that you would find in a museum? These are what I'm going to call exhibited depictions. That is, they are created at one time and they're exhibited at another time. So this was created by Picasso in like 1920, and it's now sitting in the Musée Picasso, which is in 2014, and so it's exhibited another time. And this contrast here, so these are really separate actions depicting the creating and exhibiting are two different actions. But that's not true here. He is creating and displaying this depiction in one action. And this is a special kind of depiction. I'm going to call these things performed depictions. And they are the topic of this talk today. Took me a long time to get here, but there we are. So what are these perform depictions. So let me give you what I see as a problem, and it may even be the problem of these depictions. And I'm going to start with this one again. That is a depiction of a phrase from Beethoven. And so he's using it, he's talking to an audience, and he's using this depiction to tell people something about Beethoven. And the question is, what is it he's trying to do? Well, if you look at it, here's what it...
This is quite difficult. Is, of course, very different from okay?
Now, did you hear the difference between dee-da-dum as opposed to dee-da-dum? This is complicated. Anyway, notice that the first depiction is, in fact, if you look at it, it's an audio depiction entirely. The second one is an audio-visual depiction. He does some gestures with it, and the same thing over here. But here is the problem. That's a noun. Now, you have never seen a noun that consisted of a depiction. I mean, there is this stuff called rebuses, but that's not what, I mean, this looks like, this is something where this doesn't look like a noun, nor does this look like a noun phrase, nor does this look like a noun phrase. So that's a problem for linguists. Linguists have no idea how to put these two kinds of things together. That is, what I'm calling performed depictions, plus the fact that they're embedded in language in this way. Okay, so that's the problem. We communicate with depictions. They're not linguistic. They are, so linguistic symbols like nouns are abstract and discrete, and they categorize. Actually, this one, these are physical analogs, and they're continuous, and they depict. They're not the same thing, but we see them being used in the same sentences, and they're a mix. And there's not a single theory out there that I know of, and Peter's going to tell me that, of course, I'm wrong, but that as far as I can see, there's no compositional theory that would be able to explain exactly this phenomenon. So, but let me go on to perform depictions in everyday discourse. Here, I just need some funny notation here. So think of that as a depiction up there, and this line, here's a description, and this is a discourse carrier. That is, it's sort of the discourse that's going on. I am going to argue that in everyday discourse, depictions really come in 4 types. And as far as I can tell, this is all of the types, but I mean, there are subdivisions here, but I'm going to argue that these are the main ones. They're embedded, they're time-linked, they're indexed, or they're discursive on their own. And let me start with the embedded one. So by this, I mean, so here's a single contribution to a discourse, like a sentence or an utterance of a sentence. And here's a depiction that is embedded in that sentence. So it's within a single contribution. And the typical ones that we all know about and love are quotations. They're embedded with a bound quotative. I'm going to call these things like he said and she said, and she's like and he's like, and she goes and he goes, and those sorts of things. But there are also ones that are just embedded as a phrase, like a word or a noun phrase, things like that, that aren't in traditional sense quotatives, or done with quotatives. So I'm going to divide in the next few minutes here the kinds of depictions I'm interested in between those that are, let me call them just embedded reports. It's a traditional discussion. They talk about speech reports, but let's talk about just embedded reports as opposed to embedded as words. And so it's going to go like this. Here is an embedded report. And so this is a piano teacher here, an absolutely fabulous woman named Light. And she's going to be describing Joe Schmo.
You know, Joe Schmo was written.
So Joe Schmo would have written, and now she depicts, gives you a nice demonstration of what it was that Joe Schmo would have written, but she doesn't do it in language. This is a performed depiction. Here's another one, Bilson doing it again.
He doesn't play. But rather he plays, he does it better than I do.
And notice, so you know this is not just playing, because he's singing while he's doing this, and he looks around at his audience and smiles broadly. This is something he would never do if he were giving a concert, playing this stuff. So this is marked as a depiction as opposed to something else, but it's also marked because it's the object of the verb play. He doesn't play, that's a kind of quotative, and now you get the thing that is quoted. And the same thing with he plays, and then you get this depiction. Here's one that's actually a report of speech, but it's actually a report of a dialogue.
I asked her to the bathroom and went out there, and she saw, "You'll never guess who's in the office." And I was like, "Who?" She's like, "MTV."
So now notice, she isn't just reporting the words here, she is dramatizing them in kind of a breathless way. You'll never guess who's in, I can't do her. I mean, this is a Southern California woman, and there's no way I'm going to be able to do that. The point here, though, is these are depictions of what she and this other young woman said, a woman named Lowe. Okay, here's another one.
I remember seeing her through the window, she's like trying to get my attention, and she was like, "Come out, come out."
So now, come out, come out. So she's now giving the speech, but she's also giving the gesture from the point of view of the person she's quoting. So the person she's quoting is a woman named Lowe, and Lowe is outside saying, "Come out, come out." And she's doing the gestures from that point of view, and the speech, and the dramatization of the sounds. Here is a really complex one, and I'm not going to tell you all the complexity here, but this is a woman named Chloe Sevigny, who is on the Conan OBrien show. You know, you get your quotations where you can get them. So here you go.
Especially in this film, because it was all.
Oh, now let me start here again. She's talking about being in a film, and she's talking about a cinematographer who was ordering her around and telling her to do things that she didn't really want to do. So, so she's a movie star. And she's talking about the making of a movie.
Especially in this film, because it was all lit from above, and so before every take, the cinematographer would be lift your chin. So when I watch the movie, I'm here like acting like this with my chin in the air. What?
Now, I hope you got the really interesting complexity of this. First of all, you see here, there's this simple quotation, lift your chin. Who's the quotation of? It's the cinematographer saying this. But she's also doing what the cinematographer was doing to her. That is, she is depicting the gestures that the cinematographer made, and she's doing it as part of the same. So this part and this part are really two things that the cinematographer is doing. She's giving you both, but notice how she's doing it. The vocal part is strictly embedded. It has to be embedded because you can't speak, you can't utter your own sentence and utter this other person's sentence at the same time. I mean, it's impossible for at least people like me to do. But this gestural part overlaps it, but overlaps the speech. It is not embedded in this classic way. It is just overlapping. And she's doing a very complicated thing here, perfectly easy to understand, and we all see what she's doing, but it's a depiction of that cinematographer and what she was doing on her own body. Okay, embedded words. I'm now turning to simpler cases here. Here is a really wonderful case. This is a guy named D.N. who's talking to Malcolm Bilson.
He found that he can do his in a much more
conversational way, because he didn't have to pitch himself and project himself over a lot of noise.
So they're talking about, in this case, this is a tenor. And he, the tenor, found he could do his, and now, what's the his? There's a noun in here. We've got a, his singing. I could have said his singing. But he doesn't do this. He gives you a depiction of the singing. Fremd bin ich ein, and it's Schubert's Winterreise-Lied, I've discovered later. And he does a little fraction of it, but he does it, and he does it, if you see the way he does it like a person on stage. So he dramatizes it, and he, in the way that this guy would have staged it himself. So let's watch it just once more.
He found that he can do his fremd.
So, fremd bin ich ein, so he's doing the gesture of the tenor that he's quoting. But he's depicting the singing. Okay. Here is, this is a tutor, and I've forgotten his name here, who is, he's an oboist, and he's tutoring this oboe player here. And you can't see him quite behind this, but listen to him.
Now you gotta you gotta feel that.
So he's depicting the way the oboe player should do this. Now you've got and all of a sudden there's this noun in there, but the noun is not a noun. It's not a nominal. It is this huge depiction of what this young woman should be doing. Got it? Here is a case where we get an adjective. This is an adjective here, and this is a violist, quite a well-known violist, because he's got his name all over the back of the wall here. Now, I love these things. The way if you're a musician, the way you get across what you're supposed to do is by doing a lot of this stuff here. So notice your strokes get a little, and he does the sounds here, but he's also doing the gestures and the constrained way in which this is all being done. But this is an adjective. It goes after a little. Now, you don't see adjectives that look like that. Now, the thing is that there are a bunch of cases in almost all languages that or at least I've ever heard of, that where you have lexicalized depictions. They're things like bang, bang, bink, bow, wow, meow, moo, cock-a-doodle-doo, tick-tock, pit-a-pat. These are common all over the place. Not all over the place, but they are supposed to be thought of or heard as a depiction of a sound. So you say cock-a-doodle-doo, that's something that a cockerel says, but it's conventionalized and in the language already this way. But that doesn't mean that they have to be entirely conventionalized. And I want you to listen to this woman here describing some gunshots that she heard.
Getting ready to go out to dinner with some friends. All of a sudden I hear this bang, 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 bang. You know, what? That was definitely a gun. It was not fireworks or no mistake. You know, I get right here, it was shut.
And all of a sudden I hear this bang, 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 bang. Now, she's using bang, which is a conventional sound for a gun, but she's giving you 5 of them, and they're in a particular rhythm. So she's taking what's ordinary, these lexicalized things, and depicting the whole rhythmic character of this long thing here as a noun. Notice that it's the finish of this noun phrase here that begins this n, this nominal, and it's this big depiction here. So here's Malcolm Bilson, and he uses bink, bink, bink. Now that isn't a common one, but he uses it as if it were common.
All you have to do is say, look, there are 4 notes here, but it's not really very natural to go bing, 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 bing. That's all you have to do.
Now notice, first of all, he has an imaginary piano out here, and he's pressing on the piano keys, going bink, 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 in this dull way. That's what he's trying to depict here. He uses the conventional word bink. It isn't terribly conventional, or it isn't terribly usual, but he uses it in a particular way. You know, he's got these 4 things in a row, and he's using them or he's saying them while he's binking on the piano. So he's doing a multiple depiction here. He's using his hands and using his voice. Here, of course, is Roy Lichtenstein, who uses these cracks and varooms and all over the place as a way of depicting sounds in this kind of comic strip form. Okay, that's embedded depictions, time-linked depictions. This is what the people in the field who study iconic gestures, roughly speaking, most of them are of this form, almost entirely of this form. They are things that are timed to go with part of your speech. So that is, you'll have a single contribution, and this will be a depiction that's timed to go with a certain part of your speech. And here's a simple example.
Diminuendo doesn't mean from fortissimo to pianissimo. It means simply what we would call the tapering.
So what we would call a tapering. So what he does here is depict a physical diminuendo sign doing this. He does it while he's saying what we would call the tapering. That is, this is time to go with this. This is time to as a sort of an adjunct piece of information about this phrase here. And I'm calling these time linked because the time linkage to these is crucial. Here's another one.
All the painter has, no matter how inspired he is, he's got his various brushes, he's got his colors, and he's got his strokes. That's it. That's all we've got.
So the point that many people would make about these iconic gestures is that if you got rid of them, you'd never notice. Actually, you would notice because there's information that is in the depiction that isn't in the sentence, but you can have the sentence without the depiction. That's not going to be true for the next category that I will show you in a minute, where you cannot do the sentence without the depiction. So these are all various ways in which the depiction is timed to go with a certain part of the sentence that's being uttered. Here is Conan OBrien giving something, a huge, immense kind of demonstration, and it goes with the sentence being produced, but it isn't required. It's, yeah.
You know, he's smearing his face with chili, but
So this is talking about one of her old boyfriends and who is messy. So hear it again.
You know, he's smearing his face with chili, but
So this is a demonstration, a depiction of this guy, you know, getting chili all over himself while he's describing it. And this is an elaboration on this. You do not have to see him to see what he's saying. Actually, this is a quotation, so you do have to have, this is embedded, but this is simply time to go with that phrase, that whole phrase that he's producing there as a kind of adjunct piece of information, and I'll get back to this maybe. Here is another one, which is much subtler, and what I want you to do is to listen to this takeoff and to this running. What she is doing in the pronunciation of the word takeoff, that is, I'm going to call these things, what am I going to call them? It's a composite of the speed with the actual pronunciation of those words here. So listen.
Yeah, I get right here. Take off down that way. Really fast here. And we were running that way.
So take off that way. So she is producing the speed with which someone took off in the very pronunciation of the word take off. So this is, it is intended, the speed change is, which is, it's put right into the pronunciation of this. is intended to be timed to go with this thing here. Now, if she hadn't, yeah, okay. That's going to be different from indexed, these indexed, things that are indexed in discourse. These can be dropped, and you wouldn't notice. These can never be dropped. These have to be produced. And it's because there's the word this in the sentence that refers to something, and it always refers to a depiction in the cases I'm going to give you. So here's one.
This is the second movement of this sonata.
He used two thises here, so I'm interested in this one. This sonata. Well, you can't just say this sonata and not have a depiction there, because that is part of what he's saying. And so he then does it immediately afterwards. Here he's going to do it coincidentally with it. That is, these are cotemporal.
I am now Mozart. Forgive the immodesty. This is what I want to write.
Okay.
How can I do it?
Yeah, how can he do it? So he is depicting Mozart as he is saying this. Now, that sentence would not make sense without the depiction that goes with it. That is, it is a crucial, necessary part of that utterance. So that makes it different from these other things that I call time-linked. And the way you want to think about it is the time-linked gesture indexes a piece of the sentence, whereas here, a piece of the sentence is indexing the gesture, or the depiction in this case here. You can have the sentence without the thing that is indexing it, but you can't have a sentence that has the index in it without the thing that it indexes, because it's got to be there. So this is a fundamental difference between these two different kinds of what are called always co-speech gestures. They are not the same thing at all. These are two, they have two very, very different properties. Furthermore, I've already shown you here, in this case, the word this sonata is followed by the depiction. In this next case, it is coincident with the depiction, and in other cases, it precedes. The sentence is coincident with a depiction, and in another case, the depiction precedes the sentence. So I can go la 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 la. Well, that is Mozart, I could say. So you have the timing of the thing that goes with it. This can vary all over the place. Not true of what I called these time-linked depictions. They have to go with what they are indexing in the sentence. These phrasal affiliates are called.
I am now.
Okay, here's again, watch, she's doing like this, and she's got an index there, and it indexes what she's doing.
When I watch the movie, I'm here like acting like this with my chin in the air.
What? Acting like this, and she points to her own gesture, which she's gesturing. So her own depiction, which she's depicting here. So that's part of this depiction here. Here's another one. This is all being done by Conan OBrien in this case.
A beautiful actress, so like our light's over here, so you have to be like that the whole movie, walking around.
So the first part is, well, our light's over here, and he's doing this pointing. This is a good indicating gesture. But here, he refers to it with that. And it would make no sense for him to be saying that without him doing some kind of depiction while he was doing it, or before or after he was doing it. Okay, here's, and this is a case where, this is the term I was trying to remember, fused. Here you're going to hear the depiction that's fused with what he's saying, and it's a really, I've already given you one example before. Here's another one.
First of all, I'm using right now a kind of medium-sized voice, because I'm talking to you over there. If this were our large Bailey concert hall, I would probably be speaking like this. And if we were sitting in my living room, I'd probably be speaking like this.
So he says like this 3 times, and the one that I'm showing you here is where he raises his voice. And it's that raised voice that he's actually using as depiction, and he indexes it with the word this. So again, but it's fused with his utterance in this case. So those are the first three categories. The thing is, these depictions can always be done on their own, and actually, the simplest case is if you go to a movie, like, you know, Pride and Prejudice, say, the movie, you're going to see the whole thing done with depictions on their own. But I'm going to show you ones that occur in ordinary everyday discourse here, too. So the first thing is, the way to think of this is there will be a single contribution here, then there will be another contribution being made, but it's solely done with a depiction. And then it's followed by other depictions that are not, other contributions that are not depictions. So here is an example. The tutor, this is Lolita Light, asking a question, how does it manifest itself? And the student doesn't answer in language, she answers with a depiction. And that seems to be just fine.
How does it manifest itself? Oh, okay.
So this is in the middle of a lesson, and by playing that phrase, she shows how she is, in fact, the student, how this is manifesting itself. Notice that this is a complete contribution. It is the answer to a question. An answer to a question is separate from the question. And as we saw yesterday, this is just an answer to this question, but it's an answer that's done by means of a depiction alone. Here's another one. This is again just the next point in a description that he's doing. You get a description here, then you get a depiction, then you go back to a description.
The last note of the slur is the weakest one and is always short.
See, this is not embedded in this sentence. It's not referred to in this sentence. It is treated as a separate contribution. Here's another one. This is a woman telling a story, and she quotes her friend Gary. She does it entirely in a separate contribution.
My friend Gary really talked me into it. Come on, we gotta audition together, we gotta be on it together. And I was kind of like, whatever, you know. And
so there's no he said, she said, anything in here. That's just there as a new contribution. And these new contributions can be of all sorts. So he walked up to the door. I'm doing the next contribution to this little story with a depiction of someone knocking. And you can do this at any time here. So that's the whole idea here of this being an independent contribution. Our old friend Deborah Tannen, do you know Deborah? Actually, I should have said this to the whole audience. Some people know Deborah. Anyway, she pointed out that if you looked at quotations in spontaneous narratives and in novels and short stories, they are independent contributions 26% of the time in the narratives, spontaneous ones she looked at. And even in novels, they're often just treated as, I mean, there's another quotation. They're not marked in any way. They're just the next contribution to that narrative. Okay, now here is, as I say here, listen to the code depiction speech that's done here. So he's depicting this thing here. It is its own depiction. It's all by itself, but he does do some language in it, but it isn't that the language is embedding the depiction. The language is now timed to go with the depiction. It's not the depiction is timed to go with the speech. It's the other way around.
It's not really a folk song, you know. And it says rubato.
So I gave you this before, and he's talking while he's giving this complete depiction, which is a contribution on its own to the discourse that they're doing here. Now, if you think about short stories, this may take longer setting up than I would like to do. They are, short stories are done I'm going to tell a joke. Let's say I start to tell a joke, and so I'm sorry. So, did you hear the one about the three Irishmen? So there were these three Irishmen, and they had three girls with them, and so I'm starting out something that is in fact fiction, and it is. I am not actually telling you something. I am depicting someone telling you something. That is, what you have here is. Narrators are being depicted in most kinds of short stories and novels. The classic novel from for Americans is Moby Dick, and it starts out, "Call me Ishmael." Now, the rest of the whole novel is just a quotation of Ishmael, basically. The whole thing is done in Ishmael's voice. Now, what I'm going to show you here is that this is just generally true. So I'm going to show you some cases where people will introduce a story in one voice, but once they get into the narrator, they take on another voice. And of course, we know that they dramatize characters' talk. So I'm going to start with the third case here. This is just someone reading Winnie the Pooh.
One day, when Christopher Robin and Winnie the Pooh and Piglet were all talking together, Christopher Robin finished the mouthful he was eating and said carelessly, "I saw a heifer on today, Piglet." "What was he doing?" asked Piglet. "Just lumping along," said Christopher Robin. "I don't think he saw me."
So he's dramatizing the characters in here, even the quotations in here that are in fact embedded, including the snorting of the pig, which I sort of like here. But here is I think it's a much more interesting case. This is a woman named Fionnuala Flanagan who is reading a story by a woman named Edna OBrien, and it turns out that, as we're going to hear here, so this is just Flanagan's street voice.
Edna, there is nobody like you. I think you're the bravest writer that Ireland has ever produced since James Joyce.
So, as it happens, Edna OBrien was sitting right there, and as she was saying all this, we now start the story in the first person.
Bad cess to him. Thinks I don't know, that I can smell a rat. All them bachelors swaggering in here, calling him out to the haggard, in case I twigged. Tootsie this and tootsie that.
So now, could you even tell it was the same person doing this as doing that? It is this is Flanagan again. This is her street voice. This is her doing the narration of this first person Irish woman, lower class woman, and giving you how she, what she's thinking here. Now she goes into quotation and she changes again.
I'll be good to you, Maisie. He says, good. Oh, a bag of toffees on a holy day. Oh, takes me for granted.
So now, this is a quotation of her brother, and this is her. That is the character, her. So again, this kind of dramatization is depicting the characters. And in this case, it's depicting the narrator, who is in fact a character in this story here. Now you think, well, so what about third-person ones? Well, third-person stories have, there's a long tradition of being interested in what's called free indirect discourse, and I'm going to show you a type of that here. Again, we have Flanagan. In this case, she's reading a thing by Chekhov, and so it's in the third person. So it's, first of all, it's Russian, and Flanagan doesn't have any Russian accent. But listen to what she does with this. This is the narrator's voice. Well, first of all,
I would like to see the collected works of Chekhov in every household, and I hope that will happen.
So that's her voice. Now listen to the narrator's voice.
On the seat opposite sits the Provincial Secretary of Special Commissions,
a budding young author who from time to time publishes long stories of high life, or novelli, as he calls them, in the leading paper of the province.
She's just terrific. I can't, it's hard to imagine better than this. Now, here she goes through 3 voices, count them. First of all, she does the protagonist's thoughts, then she does the protagonist's speech, and then she goes back to the narrator. And listen to this very last phrase, because the narrator's speech is different again. So, let's start with the protagonist.
He is gazing into her face, gazing intently with the eyes of a connoisseur. He is watching, studying, catching every shade of this exceptional, enigmatic nature. He understands it, he fathoms it. Her soul, her whole psychology lies open before him. Oh, I understand you to your inmost depths, says the Secretary of Special Commissions, kissing her hand near the bracelet.
Now, I talk about subtlety of doing this, but she's doing what many of us would try to do if we're reading something to our kids, or, I mean, this is the way you should be hearing the voices anyway. That is, if you just think about the places where this kind of depiction is required in storytelling and narratives, it's in the narrator's voice, in the character's speech, in the character's actions. So we heard kisses and sighs and snorts. Other events like banging and barking, you'll hear that kind of stuff. And the main protagonist's thoughts, and that was what was happening in this last piece when he fathoms it and so on. It's third person, but it's it's called free and direct discourse, and it's just absolutely all over the place in modern literature. Okay, now we can also think of dialogues. Many kinds of dialogues are discursive depictions, and this requires the collaboration of the addressee to do this right. And here is an example of Gerald. This is from Paul Drew. Gerald just got a new car, as it says here, brand new sports car. And Gerald says, "Hi, how are you?" And Martha says, "Well, you're late as usual," says Gerald. And Lee, these are real conversations here. Lee says, "What's the matter? Couldn't you get your car started?" "That's right, I had to get it pushed." Who knows how the laughing sounded here. This is not to be taken seriously. This is a tease. And Gerald actually gets into the whole thing and takes the tease seriously, as if seriously. So this looks like a pair of serious things, but these are both depictions of what some people are doing, but it's not real. It's not the actual way things are going. This is a layer. I'll get into this in a couple of days. Okay, here's another case of teasing. Again, this is, I love 70s, so why not use her again here? So she's just come onto the program, and here is O'Brien.
You look beautiful.
Thank you.
Will almost wore that outfit when he came here. Inches away. They decided that wouldn't be cool.
So Will almost wore that outfit when he came here today. Inches away, he says. So Farrell gets into this, and O'Brien gets into this. Then he decided it wouldn't be cool. These are just not true. There's nothing true about all. This is a little piece of tease, which is done as a piece of what you're doing is depicting a couple of people saying things that we're supposed to take seriously, but of course we don't. We are not supposed to take that seriously. That's simply a tease, and that's the way teases work. Okay, why use these staged interchanges? So the tease, and there are a bunch of other cases that we can do. These are to really get your addressee and yourself engaged in imagining scenes in which you are playing certain roles. And actually what this does is to then create certain kinds of interpersonal emotions. They come out and they get interestingly done, but they are not the real emotion. That is, if you're showing humor or showing various sorts of things that you're doing, or showing rage and so on, these are just depictions of those emotions. They are not the real emotion. Okay, so depicting. A form depictions takes all these forms. I've just been trying to argue with you. And there are these three forms of signaling, and this is only one of them down here. And it deals, the depicting one deals with perceptual appearances, things that you would be able to, scenes that you'd be able to see or hear. So if we go back to Obama and Cameron, this is the way the 21st century view, that what you would do here. But here is the way I would argue that we should be doing this. So there's the describing part, this is stuff here. There's the depicting part, where he's saying, stay back. But he's depicting what this guy would be saying. And then there's the indicating part, which is words like I, which refer to things, but also these sorts of things. So he's depicting this, and these two guys are looking at each other, and that's another way that they are telling each other that they are both part of the same conversation. It's something I'll talk about in a couple of days. So there we are.
Thank you very much. I guess there must be many questions. Who's first?
Should it back?
Well, thank you for two very nice, very interesting, very convincing talks. There is, though, one single thing that if perhaps I misunderstood you, I say I don't understand, and that is yesterday's complete dismissal of speech act theory. Now, let me finish before you, Well, I can see that, speech act theory abstracts sort of the listener away. Therefore, for instance, Searle cannot say some of the things you said yesterday because they fall outside his abstraction. Nonetheless, I think that you or some other cognitive scientists may profit from using his classifications of speech act, or perhaps some other, because when speech act came about, speech act theory, and I regard Searle as the most prominent figure in the movement, then they accused philosophy of language for being obsessed by descriptions, and so Austin's famous how to do things with words, and then came Searle. I like his so to speak, upper genera, his main classification of speech act. You mentioned some of them yesterday. Now, but listening to your talk today, well, you seem to me to also be close to staying in a kind of slot which is dominated by descriptions, dominated by depictions, even though you are not talking about it. But of course, since I was watching now, at the end of the talk you brought in teasing can't be description, or creating a laughter cannot be depiction. So I think you could have...
Sorry, teasing is a depiction.
Yeah, but okay.
I just making sure that I understood what you were saying here.
Now, then I misunderstood you a little, but then take my general point that, as far as I can see, you can... someone may one day write the book, How to Do Things with Pictures, just as Austin wrote, How to Do Things with Words, because you call depicting, and then you think of something analogous to descriptions. You don't think of something analogous to promises or orders, but of course you can use pictures to embed them into wholes that are orders and promises and so on. So now I end. My question, why did you dismiss speech act theory yesterday in such an outright complete dismissal?
Thank you very much for that long preface to that, that point. If I somehow gave the impression that I was dismissing all of speech act theory, that's just wrong. That is, I surely am not doing that, and I didn't mean to do that. I, in fact, started my direction down this path by being really inspired by Austin and Searle. So you should never take me as doing that. What I was trying to argue is that speech acts, so I've argued this in print at a couple places, that the speech acts are impossible to categorize unless you see them as part of a pair of actions. That really is the part that so here's where and I think actually Austin had that idea, and you see it. He talks about bets. So a bet isn't a bet until you take it up. So I say, I bet you $5, and you say, okay. And now we've made a bet. And he says, there isn't such a thing as a bet without the uptake. Now, Searle said, ooh, this is hard. Let me get rid of that part. And he gets rid of that part altogether. That's the part that I am unhappy with. It's too bad that Searle did this, and it took me years before I decided that that was a stupid thing for him to have done, but that's what he did. So that's the part that I am, unhappy with. But then, what did I do? I used Searle's classification of speech acts as a way of classifying these pairs of utterances. What are they doing as a pair? And notice that a bunch of things that you can't get done without the second half of these pairs. And that's the whole point of all of these things. The speech acts that these guys are typically talking about are the first halves of a pair of things that will come up as a joint commitment, but you don't get the joint commitment from the one part alone. And trying to abstract, so I think ultimately it's a mistake to confine yourself to the abstraction of the first part alone. That's really the argument that I was trying to make. And if I sounded dismissive of all speech act theory, clearly I think, so if you read especially Austin, seriously, you're making a commitment when you, or trying to make a commitment when you are saying something with the first part of one of these parts. But they don't discuss the fact that it takes the second part and to get this done. Well, so here is, I'm going to do a really simple case for you. So I say, sit down. Now, what is that? Searle classification. So this is a directive, right? Sit down. So I say, sit down. But then Marianne says, oh, what a good idea. She just took it as a suggestion. Or she says, yes, sir. Now she takes it as an order. Or she says, okay, she's now taking it as a request. That is, what this is taken to mean depends on what the second part is. And you cannot know in general what is happening here without the second part. And the second part is sometimes a standard speech act like a promise. For example, I say, hand me the book, and you say, okay. The okay is a promise back, but it's a promise to that request that I made. So these things, they just will be always incomplete. That's the real argument without thinking about the two parts. I have an even older argument that I made in an really old paper where Searle just treats the here as irrelevant, completely irrelevant, but I can, this paper is just, this is a paper I did with a guy named Tom Carlson. We show just one example after another where you have to know who is being addressed in a certain way. So let me just do a simple one. So with the person who leaves, the last person to leave this room, please turn out the lights. Now I've made a request. Who have I made it to? Well, I haven't made it to the listeners. I've made it to only the person who is the last one to leave this room. It's a very particular listener. Well, you can't know when I'm saying it. I can't know when I'm saying it who I'm making the request of. Now, Searle's whole account has no way of dealing with those sorts of things because he has never been interested in the listener. And that would be another part that I would want to argue. So it's not that it's wrong, it is just incomplete. That's really the argument.
Thanks. So I'm going to come at you from the gesture corner. This won't surprise you.
I couldn't have guessed.
I'm a Magritte too. I like that term.
Yeah.
The Pazun principle is excellent. This is, of course, the fact that a depiction is not the thing it depicts is exactly what gesture people have kind of been trying to formulate in some sort of sensible fashion in order to talk about gestures as potentially being different from practical actions, for example.
Sure.
Now, you don't really talk about the gesture field here, so I kind of feel like I want to go on record here as saying that there are things in the beautiful thing, you know, the beautiful examples that you've given, for example, of the way in which speech and gesture don't necessarily overlap temporally, but do slightly different things, where gestures are embedded and sort of slot in nicely into constituent places. Mixed syntax, 1976. Right?
Who, this is, you're thinking of Dubois? No, who?
Slama Kazaku.
Okay.
Obscure
sorry.
reference, right?
Yeah.
No, but I mean, I'm just...
What did she do with her mixed syntax?
She noticed it.
She noticed it. Okay,
and so I'm not.
So I've now got a classification of at least these sorts of depictions.
But so what I was going to lead up to is that what is really, really nice about what you've shown us is that it's a much richer picture of how.
Picture.
Yes,
I like that.
I didn't say depiction, but you know, it's a much richer and a much more complete depiction of the different ways in which we use all the resources that we have in order to achieve certain things, right? To make believe, which is kind of, you know, how we play, basically.
Right.
Now, my question,
and that's
sorry, that was a long
theory. It would be,
preamble.
It's make believe, and that's actually Ken Walton's theory of depiction.
I think is absolutely right. That's what we do.
So good for you.
But well, thank you. But so my question here is, how? Because I do still think that you haven't mentioned the gesture field, right? And it's as if it wasn't there. You're talking about linguists not thinking seriously about gestures and all that kind of thing, which may or may not be true. But
I'm thinking
but
of
I'm wondering, so
generic ones, and I don't consider you generic in any way.
I'll take that as a compliment.
Yes, you should.
But I'm wondering how, for example, your view of the relationship between these different resources that we have and that we can mobilize and co-orchestrate and so on, how that might be different from what Kendon calls utterance visible action.
Who calls this?
Kendon.
Kendon, yeah.
So Adam Kendon, who is neither a psychologist nor a linguist.
He's a descriptivist of
he's a
the most incredible ability
but
to
so
describe.
he no longer uses the term gesture, right? He talks about utterance visible action.
Good for him.
As a way, I think, to do the same thing as what you're trying to suggest here, namely that there is a different way of looking at how these things that we have been trained to call modalities come together to achieve these complex notions that you know you've shown us. So
yeah, so I would agree. I haven't seen this this work in which he talks about
Big Book 2004.
No, so that doesn't say those words in there, does it? Well, it's in a part that I don't remember, but.
But this is his view, anyway. Sorry.
Yeah. It's his view.
This is his view anyway of how
Good for him.
the thing
Good.
that we call
Yeah.
speech and gesture come together, and I think it's
so I'm happy with this.
Germane to
so
what
then
you're
the
suggesting.
question is, what is so gesture? As you know, has I mean there are two. I actually have always disliked the word gesture because it says you're only worried about the hands, as opposed to facial gestures where you're worried about the face and things that you're using your whole body. And I'm going to talk about some of that tomorrow and the next day. These get completely squashed in with indicative sorts of things that one is doing. And I'm going to talk, I'll leave some of this for tomorrow, otherwise I don't have anything to say tomorrow. But you're doing a lot of pointing, but you're also doing depicting while you're pointing. And some of Adam's examples have the pointing is a crucial part of the depicting that you're doing. So you're doing various things like this. And this French woman, Chabris, has lots of examples where you're depicting towards someone. That is, it has an indicative quality to an indicative part. So it's one of these things that I would say is a composite. That's composite of a depiction plus an indicating something or other. And I'll talk about that.
Good, because that was my next question. The layering, the composite nature of this also moves further into the gestural side of things. Precisely this business of you can't really tell an iconic gesture apart from something with a deictic inflection. Again, using Adam Kendon's term, right? Many iconic gestures will have deictic inflections.
So I don't think there ever is such a thing as a pure iconic gesture, and probably not even a pure indicative gesture. I mean, there are these things that look like they're sort of pure, but this has a conventional part to it. This is, again, Kendon's point. But again, we will not discuss this stuff unless we make the division into depicting, indicating as methods. And every utterance, I mean, I gave you this first utterance that is just full of this. I mean, it's a mix of these, or a composite of these three methods in various ways. And this is just a simple case. And the 7E examples are just full of, I mean, of really complex. She's clearly trying to do two or three things at once, but one of them is the method that she's using is depicting. And another one is describing, but she's also pointing at herself and pointing at her chin and depicting with her chin. She's all of this stuff. So if you're really into it, you've got to worry about all of those things. But if you don't start making at least some kinds of divisions here or distinctions, you lose what's really of interest in this. So to me, it was a complete surprise to me when I sat down and I eventually figured out, no, these indexing, these indexed gestures or these indexed depictions are just the opposite of what I call the time-linked depictions. And these are radically different in their use and their relation to utterances and lots of other things. So, and I have a feeling, so Adam has a point in his book in which he refers to, he says this woman from Sweden thinks that, in fact, there's a continuum here, and he sort of starts to argue with this, and I realize, of course, this she's right. It was the first time I've ever agreed with you ever. So no, that's false.
Oh, thank you for your beautiful examples showing how the modalities are orchestrated and come together. And I have one comment, one question. The comment is on the beautiful example. You guided us kind of through the complexity of these examples, and the complexity was increasing. And one of the examples, when the actress is speaking about the lifting the chin, I was intrigued. It was fascinating that she's kind of there at two different points of time. First, she is showing and or depicting and talking about the filming situation, where the director instructs her how to do that, and that the second time she is kind of watching the film, the result of the filming, and quoting herself doing this, how she is reacting to this film. So she's there at two different points of time and quoting on different levels. That was just fascinating.
So Marianne knows this work, and I've forgotten the woman's name, who she's in. Where is she at? She's done these, what she calls dual depictions, and there are a couple of people. There's a old student of Dan Slobin's who's done some of these dual depictions. She's got a triple depiction there, and it's really wild because she does the quotation of the speech, she does the depiction of the guy patting her, but she does herself as raising her own chin. So she's so this is the cinematographer. Is that the way she did it?
That was the beauty of it.
So I should notice this sort of thing, because it's like the woman saying, "Come out, come out, come out." But the whole point is these are not they're not very common. They're hard to do, but here's Sevigny just doing it in kind of a trivially easy way. By the way, Bilson does this all the time. He says, da da dum, and he's doing a director and he's singing the piano part. So he's doing a dual depiction in those cases. They're all over the place. In his own lectures, they were all over the place. So it isn't that they are not done. It's they're hard to do, and they're not obvious places to do them, but they get done.
Then I have one question concerning unusual types of quotations. I was thinking of Deborah Tannen's hypothetical thoughts. You were talking about animating, depicting thoughts. She's also talking about impossible thoughts, and we have.
Where does she? I don't know where she discusses this, but then
is it? It's 89 in her article about imitating voices, and then we had spoken conversational data from different genres. We had narrations, argumentative text, and we had public discussions. And there were several cases of hypothetical thoughts in these different genres, quite different from narrations. And there was also some kind of typification going on, not only quoting a particular person, but also typifying a good citizen or a typical politician or something that was impossible that somebody would say. So it seems that the functions, what we want to do with quotations, can vary in different genres too. And my question was whether you find these examples. They are quite rare, but the question is whether you, in your data, could find similar examples of more hypothetical or impossible, even impossible
quotations.
Quotations.
So I was just going to pull out my old paper, which I think you know.
1990.
Because we just a whole bunch of those examples in there. Do I have it with me? But yes, they occur all over the place. I think the way quotations are used for various purposes is, there's an enormous variety of things that you can do with them. But this is true just with depictions in general. There are all sorts of reasons. Yeah. Here's Bilson giving you depictions of piano playing because that's the best way to show you. And Lolita Light, same thing. That's the best way to show you how these things work. I don't have it with me. Now, shame on me. But we have examples like here's my favorite about thought. So I was thinking about what she told me the other night. I said, I should have thought of that. That should have occurred to me. Now, when you do this, this is not something that is a part of a thought, that you're hitting your head with your palm of your hand. I mean, that's just not what you're thinking. You're thinking, I mean, the thought is some form, but you certainly, by depicting this, you're depicting someone saying what they're thinking, as opposed to, you're not depicting, the thought doesn't have that in it. And we have a bunch of cases where the thoughts are things like my big toe said, oh, I'm just going to curl up here and I hate it. The way, now you're talking about your big toe.
Yeah, yeah.
And the other cases that I was going to try to find in there are cases of politicians saying, you know, a bunch of people came up to me and said, Ed, you should run for the Senate. Well, they didn't all say that. They said things, you should come up and run for the Senate in many different ways, but he typified the way they did this by this one quotation. And this is, there are lots of examples that we have in that paper of those sorts of cases. There are a bunch of new papers out on people using quotations for various things, and it's not surprising, I suppose, or maybe it is surprising, why choose a quotation over a non-quotation? So I could say, Marianne said that Adam had a really interesting example, as opposed to Marianne said, Adam has a really interesting example that you should look at. Now, in one case, she's dramatizing what Adam said. In the other case, she's just describing it. Now, why do one as opposed to the other? That's the most basic problem. But even once you get into the depiction, so I'm going to do this one. So I could say, Wolfgang, I was talking to Wolfgang Klein, you know, a couple weeks ago, and he was about to go out to dinner, and he said, "Are you hungry?" And I said, "Sure." And or he said in German, "Are you hungry?" And I said, "Sure." Or he said, "Haben Sie Hunger?" And I said, "Jawohl." And so I could have done that quotation either in English or in German, and by announcing that he said it in German in the second case. All of these are possible. Why do you choose one of these over the other? And again, these are interesting questions about which I have zero answers at the moment, but I'm sure people in this room have lots of answers.
Yeah, I was thinking of maybe quoting sensitive content and kind of taking the distance.
That's the other one.
Like a face work, not to be attributed to the contents of the...
So this guy came up to me and he said, "You asshole." Now, so I'm quoting him, and I can only say words like that in quotations because they're not mine. If they're mine, then you know that would be thought to be really rude in English. Maybe all you guys don't know the English, but boy, would that be rude.
Any more questions?
Don't we have some questions about rhythm back there? That's what I'm waiting for.
Yeah, I just want to try to make you understand my views on speech act theory, because it can be related to language by gestures, language or communication by gestures as well. I've heard over the last year some talks about gestures and language and so on. And if you allow yourself to talk about the sender and the receiver of a gesture, and as a short-term abstraction, theoretically short-term abstraction, abstract the receiver away, then in my opinion, you can classify gestures almost exactly the same way as Searle has classified speech acts into assertives, directives, exclamations, declarations, and commissives. Commissives are where we find the promises. And I guess the most common gesture for promises, you shake hands. That's a gesture, and that establishes a promise. So just,
Notice you cannot abstract away the second party in a handshake. No, not That is the crucial point.
Yeah, but I have understood the point. I admit some things you said yesterday cannot Searle with his abstraction say, but you were pretty rude yesterday saying, oh, Searle and this kind of that's, they make language into magic.
If I sounded rude, I apologize. I seriously apologize. I'm taking this.
Searle is rude as well.
Now, so I have to ask my other people in the audience whether they thought I was that rude.
Okay, that's forget it.
But so there, actually, the shaking of hands is a really interesting example because notice. I initiated it by putting my hand out, and he accepted my handshake. We did not complete the promise until he shook my hand. I am now just suggesting, proposing that we promise to each other certain, that is, we're committed to greeting each other.
But you yourself said that Searle, as Austin say, there has to be an uptake. There has to be
that's what
a receiver. Yeah.
That's what. So he has what I call the post office view of this. So you do a speech act, and he actually says this. That's complete, and then you send it off, and it does. If it's never heard by anybody, it's irrelevant. If it's never understood by anybody, it's irrelevant. But in fact, speech acts, the whole point about a speech act is it's intended to be recognized as such. And so his own theory just cannot do that. I mean, because the way he states it. Now, you may say, well, he's abstracted something away, and that's fine. I would like to argue that if you don't think about, as he didn't, first of all, you can't do the things that I was just describing, the ones in which I say, the last person to leave the room, please turn off the lights. That's impossible in his theory. It's just impossible. And there's I have a whole raft of examples in this old paper. If I could send you the paper and you say, Clark is right to dismiss speech act theory out of hand. No, I do not do this. I actually love speech act theory because it's the way I get into the first. So you ask, what is a speaker trying to do when he or she initiates the first of one of these, what I call proposal uptake cases? Well, that's, at least it's well described by Searle's analysis. I mean, his 5 categories are, to this day, actually, and of course Bach and Harnisch have a 6th category. They're wonderful. This is a fabulous way of characterizing a lot of stuff that's going on. It is not complete, and the parts that's not complete and the part that is abstracting away are the things that I am particularly interested in because I'm interested in the coordination problem. You and I are coordinating on what it is that you mean by what you say, and you and I cannot do that without this uptake. And good old Austin said that, to give him credit. Searle has, he has a bunch of things to answer for. I think he screwed up Grice royally, and I have never forgiven him for that either. I think Grice had a whole lot of things right, and then along came Searle and screwed things up. But then that's another story. So I dismiss, no, I don't do that.
Okay, just have a short question. Perhaps we can go back to iconicity and subdivisions of iconicity. And I thought about where do you put diagrammatical thinking in this? Because I think in some sense the time-linked category could be diagrammatical iconicity.
So
but it could
give me
also
an
be
example
in the
of
narrative and in the perceptual category of your 4 types of depictions here.
So I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, I think that the diagrammatical iconic relation is not perceptual in the same sense of perceptual mimetic relations when you use the perceptual.
Well, I don't know what you're referring to.
Mathematics, in a sense.
Mathematics.
But I'm thinking about diagrammatics. It could be used as, you know, kind of proportional similarity relations or depictions.
So remember, I call them physical analogs. So a physical analog can take all sorts of forms.
Yeah, but a physical analog but it could be a perceptual experience, but it could also be a conceptual experience. So when you talk about millions of people in some sense, and you have a diagrammatical relation, you make this is so big and this is close to and so on, but it is not the perceptual experience, it's a kind of conceptual experience.
Now
so
notice I didn't use the word perceptual either. I said physical. Now, physical can have all sorts of things. It's often perceptual, but it has a conceptual part to it too.
Okay, you don't need that kind of division, because I could see there's a need of that division when you talk about types of depictions.
Okay, I'm not quite sure what the problem here is yet. I mean,
it's not a problem in that I don't know if it's a problem. It's a question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so let's take a diagram used in math. So a colleague of mine, Barbara Tversky, has been looking at the way people use charts and graphs and diagrams and of all sorts for all sorts of purposes. And that's fine. I've limited myself in this talk to what I've called performed depictions.
Yeah, and all there are no diagrammatic performance in these kind of speech as you, because I thought there were in those examples as well, but maybe you don't.
Well, I don't see them. There is a case to be made for. This is an old colleague of Marianne's and mine, a guy named David Wilkins, who studies the Arnta people. This is in Australia, who, as they're telling stories, they have a big sand thing out in front of them, and they're constantly making diagrams and pictures in the sand. And when they get done with a sentence or a paragraph, they will smooth this out and then start on the next one. Now, these are a sort of depiction, but they leave a permanent thing behind. And so just as they're kind of a, let's call them a hybrid of the two kinds of depictions. You see me depicting by doing something while I'm saying something. So there is this immediacy, but nevertheless you're leaving behind an artifact of what I depicted. And none of these other cases, there's nothing left behind. There's no artifact that's left behind.
No. I don't see that the diagrammatic method has to leave the diagrammatic token behind. It could be the same. It's a matter of method.
So I say the circumference of a circle, and I do the circumference. Is this what you're thinking of?
Or the timelines, as you put. You had the time. I thought the time linked. When you had the example of the time linking, that was a diagrammatic method, but I could see it could be also in the narrative, and
timing, meaning the graphs I had of timing, but those are artifacts again. So this is, well, did I have something that I was showing time by doing this?
No, not timing. In your own example.
Oh, time linked.
Yeah.
As far as I know, they were all just ordinary, what I call performed depictions.
Yeah, you don't need that distinction.
And they have to be timed right with respect to other things that you're doing. I mean, but this is true of everything you do in communication. Communication is occurring in time, and the times when you start something, the times when you finish something, all is crucial. There's a question over there.
What is the status of directives in your model? Are they descriptions?
Directives?
Yeah.
No, it's just one kind of yes is the answer. It's one kind of use of, whenever you're using words as symbols in the sense of purse symbols, that is arbitrary signs that go with what they mean, then you're doing what I call describing as, I call it. I have this little hyphen in there. So all things that are symbols are basically describing as, because they categorize things. That's what they do. That's their intent. So
right. But the main function of the directive is an interpersonal one, not an ideational one. So not describing the world, but getting stuff done.
Yeah,
at an interpersonal level.
That was what I discussed all day yesterday.
Yeah.
I mean, so you use ordinary, simple utterances to make directives, and you're starting to do something together. Now, this is orthogonal, entirely orthogonal to what I was talking about here with these three methods. Because I can point and I mean, get the hell out of here. But I'm doing this by means of a point. I'm not saying anything, I just point. And under the right circumstances, that's a directive. So I can use depictions as directives, I can use pointing as directives, I can use sit down as this one right here as a directive.
So they're two separate layers, separate levels
of
analysis?
Methods are orthogonal to what you're doing. So there are some things that are easier to do with describing as, with symbols, than with depictions or with pointing or with indicating. But nevertheless, it's roughly speaking orthogonal to what all these other things that I talked about yesterday. Yeah. So a method is a method. It's not a speech act. It's not a type of speech act. It's not anything like that. It's a method.
I understand your point. I still think that maybe description.
No, describing as.
Describing as,
describing
right? But there's nothing being described really when I say
when you say sit. The word sit is a description. It's a categorizing object. This categorizes a set of actions out in the world as instances and non-instances of this type. And this is what I mean by describing as. So this describes X as a kind of sitting.
Okay.
And
that hasn't occurred yet, so it's in the.
It doesn't matter when
it doesn't matter.
No, it's arbitrary. I mean, here I'm not varying at all from classical. In fact, all classical linguists are dealing with this stuff here. All classical linguists who don't deal with gestures, that's what they're doing here. So if you take, people in this room who do compositional semantics, it's all with this stuff. So you've got a bunch of these little symbols, and they have the relation of describing as, either alone or in compositions, of things out there. Now, that's a radically different method from the method of depicting something or pointing at something. That's the only point of my talk today.
Thank you. Okay, so with that, let's thank OBrien.
Thank you.